transit services are at risk. This is the case with a lot of cities across the US. Many US transit agencies in cities of all sizes are currently about to deal with a new looming threat that could cause severe impacts to those who work for and use transit. From a reduction in frequency on existing services, reduced operating hours, and even some lines and services being cut entirely. And the worst part is, this is a recurring problem for transit agencies, with many of them staring down this issue every few years. This is the fiscal cliff. But just what is the fiscal cliff? Why do transit agencies see it happen every few years? And is there any way to fix this problem that plagues American transit agencies and threatens to cut essential transit services? Now, I'm sure a lot of you already know what a fiscal cliff is, but for anybody who doesn't care to be a massive money and finance nerd, a fiscal cliff is known as a budget shortfall. Essentially what that means is that the funding is not adequate for the current proposed budget, also known as being short $1. Now, this isn't just a transit exclusive problem. I mean, back in 2012, the federal government of the US almost had this problem, which is where we got the term fiscal cliff from. But this is a major recurring problem for almost all major transit agencies across the US. Over the next 5 years, at least half of all smaller transit agencies will be facing a budget shortfall. And it's even worse for major transit agencies, with around 70% of them facing this budget shortfall. Now, you might be wondering how this is the case. I mean, most people pay their fares. Heck, I even got some of the transit agency's merchandise. And historically, this is how transit has funded a vast majority of maintenance and operations. Not the merchandise part, just the fares. And when you calculate how much an agency is funded by these fares, it's called the farebox recovery rate. Unfortunately, due to events in 2020, ridership fell significantly. And while it has recovered quite significantly for some agencies, many other public transit agencies are still dealing with lower ridership post-pandemic. But this isn't the only way that transit agencies get funded. Transit agencies often get additional funding from local and regional taxes. These are usually sales taxes that have been approved by voters to fund additional service improvements and extensions. Another major source of revenue is from grants provided by states and federal agencies. These state and federal grants are usually used for major expansions and improvements to transit networks, but they can also be used on certain standard operations depending on the grant, such as improving bus fleets. While these past few funding sources are the most major funding sources for transit agencies, there are also smaller other sources of revenue that they can generate from selling ad space or merchandise. But one major problem that nearly all of these funding sources have is that they can vary quite drastically year by year. And that was the case with farebox recovery for almost every agency in the country. Due to the events in 2020, ridership fell significantly. And while it has recovered quite significantly for some agencies, many other public transit agencies are still dealing with lower ridership post-pandemic. This lowered ridership has significantly reduced the farebox recovery rates for transit agencies, which leads to revenue shortfalls. On top of this, many transit agencies took out loans to cover their operating expenses early in the pandemic, which still need to be paid back. This 1-2 punch combo has exacerbated the fiscal cliffs that many transit agencies see. But what exactly is the problem if these agencies can't come up with the funds for their new budgets? If a transit agency cannot come up with the money to meet its new operating budget that it has laid out, then agencies are going to have to resort to the other two methods of budget balancing, and that is cost cutting and fare increases. Some of the earliest steps that transit agencies will take are to cut the areas that aren't going to have an immediate effect on service. Oftentimes, this starts with hiring freezes to non-essential positions, such as in planning or other high-level positions within the agency. But most of the time, these minor cuts are not enough to help balance the budget, and transit agencies have to resort to more desperate measures, and this includes service reductions and fare increases. But before we get into that, if you want to support Climate in Transit, gain early access to videos, your name in the credits, and more, feel free to check out my Patreon. But let's get back into the video. One state that is is seeing some of the worst potential cuts are both of the major cities in Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh and Philadelphia both have major transit agencies that many people rely on to get to where they're going. But both of these Keystone State cities are looking at fairly severe cuts and increases to fares if they cannot make up this funding gap. Pittsburgh Regional Transit, which manages transit for not just the city of Pittsburgh, but also many surrounding communities around the metro area, is one of the major agencies looking at not only fare increases, but also major cuts in service. If funding for Pittsburgh Regional Transit isn't met, then the system faces some dire consequences. First, fares across the system would see a 20% increase over the current rate that they see now. But arguably the worst part would be the system cutting off 35% of all services in the region. This not only includes the removal of over 40 bus routes, but also one of the city's light rail transit lines. This move would cut off 19 municipalities from service on the Pittsburgh Regional Transit network. However, it would not just be the 40 lines that would be seeing cuts, as nearly 53 other bus routes and the Red Line LRT line would see major decreases in service. This includes a total elimination of nighttime service after 11 p.m. and enhanced service for events like sports and concerts being completely wiped out. PRT also faces service cuts and price hikes to its paratransit service, which would face an over 60% reduction in zones for it, and another 20% increase in fares on the paratransit. Pittsburgh won't be alone in these cuts, as Pennsylvania's largest city, Philadelphia, is also up for them. Cuts to Pennsylvania's largest transit agency, the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transit Authority, known as SEPTA, is looking at cuts just as significant as what's coming to Pittsburgh, with SEPTA staring down the barrel of cutting 50 bus routes, 5 regional rail lines, a 20% reduction of frequency on all transit lines, no late night service after 9 p.m. on the regional rail, no special event service, and a more than 21% increase in fares. These are just two cities that are facing this level of cuts, and while they do have a good chance to avoid it, it's still very much looming large in the future. But PRT and SEPTA are not alone in this, with nearly 70% of large transit agencies in the US facing this level of cuts over the next 5 years. This level of fare hikes and service cuts feed into an incredibly dangerous positive feedback loop, where increased fares and service cuts lead to lower ridership. This lower ridership continues to reduce funding, leading to increased fares and service cuts, which lowers service, and so on, until the transit service is essentially non-existent. But is there anything that we can do about this so we can resolve these immediate cliffs and prevent them from happening in the future? One of the biggest things that many people and government agencies do not understand is that transit is an essential service that is meant for everyone to use. It is made to be accessible and get people of all walks of life to where they're going in an efficient, affordable, sustainable, and safe manner. While perception of public transit and multimodal cities is changing in much of the public eye positively, and even amongst some representatives in government, many of our funding systems for infrastructure are set up for the building of roadway infrastructure, with it having an entire focus on moving more people in cars. This funding system is set at every level of government, from local municipalities all the way to the federal level, and is a massive problem. While roadways are always going to need to be repaired, improved, and optimized to be safer and more multimodal, the current way we go about funding our infrastructure in the US sees roadways and cars as the only tool that can be used to get people around between cities, and transit more or less as something that's just a flashy vanity project only meant for major cities. And the only way they get that funding is if they beg hard enough and show off big projects to gain flashy grants that don't provide any stable funding. Decades of data has shown that widening roads actually causes traffic in our cities to get worse. And focusing on changing these funding systems for infrastructure in cities to actually allow for more local, state, and federal dollars would provide consistent funding and expansion for these transit systems, would lower the cost of maintaining and expanding these transit services, and allow for transit agencies to develop more comprehensive long-term improvement plans to make transit better, and to eventually aim for a goal of not only providing adequate funding for public transit, but providing extra funding for major transit projects around the US. This is not an easy task to take on, but there are things that we can do to help us in the short term, as well as pushing towards towards a more stable, consistent funding source in the future for public transit. Writing or calling your local representative to tell them that you support transit and wish to see it get funding to avoid fiscal cliffs is one way that you can do it. But even easier than that is to just take transit in your city. Agencies use ridership data as a part of their funding, and riding transit not only financially supports your city's transit agency through fares, but also helps improve their ridership numbers. Also, you might just like it enough to take it again. A comfortable, easy, and affordable way to get around your city is what we all need now more than ever. Securing the funding for our city's public transit is crucial to ensuring that people in our cities have healthy, sustainable, economically prosperous communities, and also an easy way to get around that doesn't revolve around a major investment. Without this funding, many cities could enter a transit doom loop, which would make our cities significantly more car dependent and worse off for the future. Hopefully, we can ensure that funding remains for these agencies so they can continue to support the cities and communities that we call home and make our cities a better place to live. But is your city's transit agency facing a fiscal cliff? How would you get around without public transit? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks to everybody who helped make this video, and a real big thank you to all of my patrons out there. They're helping make videos like this possible and also getting rewards like early access to videos, extra video content, their name in the credits, and much more. And if you want to get access to these sweet benefits or just want to support the channel, the link is down below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, I'll see y'all on the next one.